You hear wave off, eject, eject, eject. And then I look out the window and I just see a small explosion on the back of the ship. And I'm like,
Oh,
oh my
wow.
God, that just happened. And so my opso, the hack, he just, over the ICS, super calm. He goes, all right, boys, this is what we trained for. Crew rig for rescue. Let's get it done.
Welcome to the Calm in the Chaos podcast, where we discuss untold heroic experiences and dive into the mindset of the Navy's elite rescue swimmers. Hosted by former U.S. Navy Aviation Rescue Swimmer, Mount Everest solo summiteer, and best-selling author Brian Dickinson.
All right. Welcome to the podcast. Mikey McKnight, 22 years, senior chief, aviation rescue swimmer, doing some amazing things, some of the first time rescues of, a certain nature. I can't wait to talk about that. You have just years of amazing experiences, and I'm so grateful that you've joined us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm super glad to be here.
Nice. So 22, you're coming up on, so you retire this year, you
I
said in
do. I do.
December. So that'll be 23 years of service. Man, that's a lifetime.
It is. It went by
Uh,
like a flash, though.
isn't that crazy? That's
It does.
that's just how things buffer, I guess. It's kind of like when you drive somewhere, it seems like forever, but on the way back, it's like your mind already has cached in all these memories, so it seems like it goes faster.
Right.
That's life, man, and it sucks too, because as you get older, you want things to slow down. When you're
Right.
younger, you want them to go fast, so it's
Right.
not fair. But yeah, so do you even remember? I mean, you're super old now. So tell
Thanks.
us tell us about your childhood. Where'd you grow up?
So I grew up in Southern California. Normal childhood. I have two younger brothers. Really had no aspirations of joining the military. I was super into sports, played football, wrestling, track, that kind of stuff, and was just really into being a teenager, and didn't really put much thought into it. I honestly thought, oh, I'll just be good at sports and I'll just go on to play college ball, and that's how it'll happen. And then when I realized that it wasn't going to happen, I was like, well, I better figure something out. And right around that time is, when 9/11 happened. And I was like, oh man, I really feel like a calling to go and do something to help out. And I remember I was working at this furniture store, and on my lunch break, I went over to the recruiting office and I wanted to join the Air Force. So I pull up in the parking lot, and I look, and there's Army, Navy, Marine Corps. I'm like, man, no Air Force, no Air Force. All right, well, guess it's not meant to be. And so I turn around and walk back to my truck, and then the Navy recruiting door flies open, and this guy Ryan, he's like, Mike. I'm like, Ryan. I'm like, I didn't even know he was in the Navy. He was my swim coach in high school. I had no
Oh,
idea
wow.
he was even associated with the Navy. He's like, oh yeah, the swim coach thing, that's my like side job. He's like, the Navy recruiting thing is my real job. And I'm like, oh. He's like, what are you doing? And I told him, I wanted to join the Air Force. And he's like, well, what do you want to do? I was like, I wanted to go. I didn't even really know what pararescue was. And so I was like, I just want to go do search and rescue. And he's like, oh, Navy's got the same thing, man. I was like, oh, for real? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, and I want to leave now. He's like, all right, well, let's do some paperwork and get it happening. And boom, I was gone. I was gone quickly. And next thing I know, I came home and I was telling my parents, like, hey, what would you guys think if I was joining the Navy? And my mom was like, well, that's a big decision. You should discuss it with your father and I. And I'm like, well, I leave
Especially
Tuesday.
that time frame, right?
Yeah,
After 9/11.
right. And I was like, well, I leave Tuesday. And my mom was like floored,
Else.
like what? And I was gone. And did the boot camp thing, and then ended up in Pensacola. And at that time, I really didn't know what I was getting into. I knew, it was going to involve helicopters, and I knew it was going to be some swimming involved, but that's about it. And I thought I was a decent swimmer. My dad was a collegiate swimmer, and I grew up around water. And so I'm like, yeah, it's going to be no big deal. And then I get to SAR school, and I'm like surrounded by, I mean, the best of the best, right? Not just even on the instructor cadre, but just the other students that are going through with me. I mean, there had one guy went to Ohio State, ran track for Ohio State, just a legend of a man. And I'm like, okay, these guys are maybe I jumped into the deep end of this pool and I don't know how to
A
swim quite well.
little bit of
But
humility.
yeah, but I just kind of looked around and I was like, you know what? I'm just not gonna quit. I'm just gonna keep going. And if that guy right there can make it, I can make it. And then, if that guy quit, then I'm like, okay, now this guy, if that guy can make it, I can make it. And I
Mhm.
just kept going. And next thing you know, before I realized it, I'm, graduating and off to the FRS and sent off to HS10, went to the FRS. And at that time, they tell you, you can pick out of the FRS where you want to go. And I'm like, yeah, I'm from Southern California. I want to stay in San Diego. I want to get orders in a San Diego squadron. So they give me orders to HS4. So I'm super pumped, and I'm a very junior air crewman and don't really know what I don't know. So I go out and do the dumb thing and buy a new truck, try to find an apartment. I haven't even checked into my new squadron yet. And, I'm super excited. And the next thing you know, the Master Chief's calling me in his office and he's like, "Hey, let me see your orders." I was like, "Oh, here you go, Master Chief." He's like, "Hey, you see that 4? We're going to put a 1 in front of that. And you're going to Japan." I'm like, "Wait, what?" And he's like, "Yep, you're going to HS-14 in Japan." And so I'm like,
Wow.
"Oh, okay." Boom, get sent off to Japan. And, talk about a culture shock. I'm the new guy getting there, don't know anything about Japan, never been out of the country. I get there to get to the shop, and I remember vividly meeting my very first senior chief, Corey Hunt. And I walk in and they're like, "Hey, you got to go check in with senior." I'm like, "Okay." So I'm in my uniform sitting in his office, and he walks in, got his cup of coffee, and I'm like, "Hey, senior." And at this point, I'm just kind of dumb in the head, and I don't know how to shut my mouth. And I had worked up this speech in my head, like I didn't want to be in Japan. So I'd done my research, and I can do a split tour. I can do my minimum sea time out there and then finish my sea counter
Yeah,
back
who's in
stateside.
control?
Right. So I'm like, I had this plan. And so he sits down and I'm like, "Hey, senior, I just want to, make it known what my intentions are. And I want to do my minimum time here. I'll do 2 years, and then I want to go back and finish my sea time in San Diego. And I'll be a good sailor. I won't get in trouble. I'll do everything. I'll get qualified, do whatever you ask. But I got to get out of here." And he just takes a sip of his coffee, doesn't say anything, and then just kind of goes through his normal spiel of like, "Hey, be a good sailor, get qualified," the normal stuff you would expect to hear from a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's it. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't even acknowledge that I just made that statement. And then fast forward 2 years later, we're on a detachment down in Okinawa, and I love Japan. I love the squadron, love the guys. We're doing some awesome stuff. And I go up to him, we're playing volleyball as a shop, and I'm like, "Senior, hey, remember that 2 years ago when I checked in and said I want to do a split tour?" Like, "No, I don't want to do any part of that. I want to stay here." And he looks at me and he's like, "Mikey, if you think for a second I was ever going to let an AW3 dictate my manpower, you had another thing coming." He's like, "I did nothing with that information. You were going to stay here no matter what." I was like, "Oh, okay." He's like, "But if I would have told you, hey, shut up and color, I'm not acknowledging that," and just jumped down your throat, he goes, "You would have been like, man, this guy doesn't care about me. He doesn't give a crap about what I'm saying."
Mm-hmm.
And then when later on, when something big happens, you would have never wanted to come to me for help. And I'm like, "Man, you're a brain ninja." And that guy really started off my career and instilled some positive leadership aspects. And Corey, if you're listening, I owe a lot to you. It was phenomenal. So
Oh, that's awesome.
yeah, finished my first sea tour. Didn't do any rescues. The squadron did, but we had an F-18 that snapped a 3-wire, went off the bow, and our plane guard bird picked up both pilots without incident. And it was kind of surreal. Everybody was just kind of like, "Yep, business as usual, moving on." And so that was my experience of the Navy initially. And then fast forward, I go to shore duty and be an FRS instructor, start teaching and molding the young guys coming in, and really enjoyed that.
Mm-hmm.
But I really wanted to continue.
That was HS-10?
No, I actually went to HSC2
Okay.
in Norfolk. So I went from Japan to Norfolk, and then was an FRS instructor out there right at the transition when they transitioned everybody to Sierra and kind of combined all the AWs. So there's no longer any flying maintenance rates, which presented its own unique challenges because I checked into the FRS as a traditional HSAW
Mm-hmm.
against a bunch of guys that were, prior mechs or airframers the day before.
Yeah, what was that like?
Oh man, they were giving me a bunch of crap like, "Oh, you're the HS guy. You don't know anything about the aircraft." And I remember doing one of my initial FAM flights in a Sierra, and the crew chief is like, "Hey, how many bearings are in the number 2 sump pump?" And I'm like, I have no idea, man, but I'll pull out this NATOPS. I'm sure it says something about that in here. And he slaps the NATOPS out of my hand and goes, "Man, you're way below where you need to be as an instructor here." And I'm like, "Yeah, but are we really, is that the focus? Is that what we need to be teaching these guys?" And so we go flying, and there's an airfield north of there, and they had a Red Air squadron there, and they had a foreign aircraft in the pattern with us. And he's like, "Man, what kind of helicopter is that?" And I look out and I'm like, "Oh, that's a Hind. That's a Russian Hind that's in the pattern with us." And he's like, "Oh, sure, you know that, but you don't know anything about our own aircraft." And I'm like, "Well,
Yeah.
I know
I
how
know
to
the enemy
defend
well.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it was a unique opportunity and experience, but really got to branch out and explore and get to know a lot of awesome people there in Norfolk. And then at that time, I wanted to stay in Norfolk. And again, the Navy would have it. They're like, nope, you're going to San Diego. So I pack up, I go to HSC 8, do a deployment there with the 8-ballers. Phenomenal shop, great group of dudes. Had a great time. Just it was a kick in the junk because there was 2 back-to-back 9-month deployments there. So the morale was a little low because guys are just burned out and tired.
Yeah.
But it was good. Then I picked up Chief and went across the street to HSC 21 and did my expeditionaries tour. And that was interesting because I'd always been a carrier guy. So now I'm getting to peek behind the other curtain there. And after that, I was like, oh man, I've seen both coasts. I've seen HSC carrier and I've seen HS and I've now seen expeditionary. Like, what's next? And so the detailer calls me and goes, hey, I can either send you back to the FRS or you can go to Fallon, Nevada. And I was like, send me to Fallon, Nevada. I haven't seen that yet. And boom, he didn't even give me a chance to respond. He just hung up the phone. And next thing you know, I got orders because not a lot of people were really looking to go to Fallon. So I go up to Fallon and
maybe on a short debt for
right,
training.
right. Go up to Fallon and man, talk about just the level of professionalism and the people up here, just absolutely amazing. I flew with arguably some of the best areas and ranges you can fly in the Navy, doing some awesome stuff, working with the best and brightest from across the fleet, both between the air wing squadrons when they come up for their pre-deployment training to the WTI candidates coming through SWITI. And just really enjoyed that. Really awesome tour. And then it was time to go back to sea duty. So I go back down to San Diego and I end up going to HSC 4. And I check in right at the onset of COVID. And so, things in the whole country were a little weird. And so I'm trying to figure out how to implement what I already know to be correct to get a shop ready to deploy with dealing with all the COVID restrictions. We're doing a lot of what we're doing right now, just talking on Zoom meetings of doing utility boards or doing, crew chief boards. And it just didn't have the same effect. So I'm like, man, I'm super concerned about this going out to sea. And at the time, the Navy was just rolling out the F-35 and, there was a whole new push that we were going to be the first carrier to deploy with the air wing of the future, the F-35, V-22s, all of it. And so I'm like, man, we haven't had a chance to get in the pool with the gear. So my swimmers have no idea how to get any hands-on practical training with this. And so I'm really concerned. That's in the back of my head. And I'm, talking to the skipper and I'm like, man, hey, sir, we really got to figure something out. And he's like, well, what are your options? I'm like, well, I would really like to go and just talk to the skipper of the F-35 squadron and say, hey, as your guys are getting dressed to go fly, can I send my swimmers into the PR shop and just watch them get dressed and say, hey, how does that piece of gear get on? How do I take that off? Or how does this work? And just get the hands-on one-on-one. I said, we'll stay out of the way. We just, send 2 at a time. We'll kind of create this little watch bill. And every day I'll just send guys down to the paralock. And he's like, oh man, I love it. I was like, okay, great. So we start doing that. And about a week into it, I asked one of my SARPO, I'm like, hey man, how's it going? Everybody getting good training out of it? And they're like, dude, we love it. It's awesome. They've been great. They're like, except for this one guy, he's been kind of a pain. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, we went in there the other day and he was like, you guys are in my way. You guys are slowing me down. I'm running behind. Like, you guys just need to get out of here. And I'm like, okay, no, that's not going to fly. So I go back down there, talk to the skipper. I'm like, hey sir, we're having some issues, but we're going to work through it. We just need to get the guys all trained up on this. And he's like, yeah, I'll fix that. Cool. So fast forward, that's at the beginning of deployment. And I had established some kind of like business rules, if you will, where I didn't want to create this flight schedule that, mandated. I mean, being on the boat, it's kind of like Groundhog Day. You kind of just live and die by the airplane, live and die by the flight schedule. So I wanted the guys to have the opportunity to still live a quote unquote normal life on board the ship, but still being on deployment and still getting work done. And so what I did is I just established standard training days, Monday through Friday. So Mondays we did gun training. Tuesdays and Thursdays we did medical training, where I had my corpsmen set up some mass casualty scenarios and we would just do some moulage and medical training. Wednesdays were gun training again. And then Fridays was nugget choice. I'd let the nuggets just pick what they want to train on, whether it be NATOPS, SAR procedures, whatever. And it was every day at 10 a.m. So that way, regardless of the flight schedule, you could make it if you could. If you couldn't, you couldn't. But at least every single week, we're getting that touch point. And so we did that. That was our standard battle rhythm for the whole deployment. And guys were being grown adults, man. They were showing up, getting training, getting good training because the second classes were running it. They were really having fun with it, messing with me, putting these crazy scenarios and oh, let's see if the old man can figure it out kind of stuff. And then fast forward, we're towards the end of deployment, and the USS Lincoln had just checked on station, and they were going to be the ones that are going to check on and take over our area of our responsibility, and so that we on the Carl Vinson could head back home. So the guys are super pumped that the Lincoln's on station, and we know that the end is near, and we're getting ready to head home. And we had just qualified one of our newest nuggets like a week prior, and he struggled. He took, several boards to get qualified, and I told him before his last board, like, hey man, if you don't pass this one, it's going to be a real hard pill for me to tell the skipper, like, hey, this guy's good, so you gotta step up. And he did. He passed. So a week later, I'm getting ready to fly with this guy, and I walk into the ready room, and he's not in there. And I'm like, wow, he's late to his brief. Like, this is not a good look. I just went to bat for this kid. And so I look at the SDO. I'm like, hey, where's this guy at? Where's this AW3? And he's like, hey, senior, calm down. Like, he was on a medevac last night. He didn't get back to the ship till 3 a.m. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, we had a dual ship medevac to 2 different destroyers 400 miles away for 2 critical patients. So we had to send 2 of our dual ox aircraft out to these 2 destroyers, pick up these patients, and then fly them into a hospital. And that took a while. And so they didn't get back till 3 a.m. I was like, oh man, that's awesome. Can't wait to hear about it. I'll talk to them when I land. But right now, who's going to go fly with me so we can just fly this plane guard event? And he's like, yeah, we're trying to figure that out. And I'm like, okay, well, I look at the ASDO who's just on watch right there, and he's one of my AW2s, fully qualified, kind of rock star. And I'm like, man, hey, what are you doing? He's like, well, senior, I'm just staying and watch. I'm like, not anymore. Grab your gear. Let's brief and let's go flying. And so he's like, heck yeah, I get to get off watch and get off the ship. Let's go flying. So, I'm flying with my OPSO, our aircrew Divo as the co-pilot, and then my swimmer, who's a fully qualified crew chief. And so, we're having a good time, just kind of BSing on plane guard, just enjoying the weather. It's a beautiful day. And next thing you know, we hear an E2 calling in on final with some hydraulic issues, some flight control issues. So we all kind of, snap to that cues up in our brain. And so we kind of join up on that and form up on that E2 as they're coming in on final, just in case something happens. And sure enough, they trap, no issues. So we're like, oh man, dang, we almost got
the
one.
Worst.
And so we had just turned downwind, and the next jet to come in on the pattern was the F-35. And so we're downwind, probably 5 miles behind the ship on the port side. And you can hear the radio calls from CAG paddles, and you hear them like, hey, you're a little low, little power, you're a little low. And then you can hear the amplification in the voice on the radio. And it's just like getting louder and louder. And you hear wave off, wave off, wave off, eject, eject, eject. And then I look out the window and I just see a small explosion on the back of the ship. And I'm like, oh my God, that just happened. And so my OPSO, the hack, he just, over the ICS, super calm. He goes, all right, boys, this is what we trained for, crew rig for rescue. Let's get it done. And so boom, we go into autopilot. And at the time, because of where we were at, our aircraft configuration was less than ideal for the SAR mission. So we had EWS, or the external weapon system pylons, so these bat wings on the side of the aircraft. We also had a port gal 21 or 50 cal, and then we had a starboard 240 with all the ammo in there. So when you have a cabin that's drastically shrunk down because of all the equipment, and before we even took off, because we had the gal in the left door, we needed to get gas. So I had shut the door to be able to facilitate getting gas on the boat before we took off. And we were running behind, and the air boss was yelling at us to get off the deck. So I told my hack, I'm like, hey, I'm going to leave the gun pinned in, and if we need it, I'll pin it out in flight. But right now, I'm just going to leave it pinned in just so we can get off deck. And he's like, yep, sounds good. Well, look now, we're going to need that gun out of the way. So we're rigging the cabin. My swimmer's getting dressed out the rest of the way. And I tell internally to the crew, I said, hey, I'm going to leave this gun pinned in. I'm going to rig the litter, and I'm going to send the swimmer down. And then I'm going to have the aircraft drift back to where the right seat pilot can keep eyes on the swimmer. And the swimmer is still plugged into ICS. So we're having this conversation because we can see a balloon parachute over a raft. That's it. We don't know if the guy's, conscious. We don't know, what his state is, but we know that we're not going to approach any closer than we have to just to get that swimmer. He's going to have to swim under and get that guy out of the raft. So I'm like, hey man, I'm going to lower you down, and then you go do what you got to do. And then I'm going to go heads down and rig the rest of the litter, pin that gun out. And then when you need it, that should be enough time for you to get the guy out of the litter, or out of the raft. And then, I'll lower the litter and we'll go through this. And he's like, sounds great. And at the time, time just slows down. Like I'm thinking
Mm.
this is just taking forever. And I'm like, man, okay, what am I missing? Because I'm just waiting on the swimmer, and he signals for the litter, lower the trail line. He grabs that, and then I lower the litter to him. He puts the guy in the litter, no issues. He gives me the hoist signal, and I start hoisting the litter up, and I'm being very conscious of not hitting that aviator into the external weapon pylon, and with that litter, trying to manage that.
Yep.
And now I'm getting ready to pull him into the cabin, and we're at the end of deployment. Our aircraft have been ridden hard, and we've used the crap out of them. So the non-skid that normally is standard in the back of the aircraft is just pretty much non-existent. And so I go to pull the litter in, and I slip both feet because now there's hydraulic fluid and now wet salt water from that litter all over the cabin, and I slip and I fall down on my back, hit my back right on the Gal 21 mount, and and then the guy is sitting on the litter on my chest, and he looks at me, and eyes just as big as raccoons, and he's just terrified. And I'm now got like
a professional.
Yeah, and now I have this adrenaline pumping, and I have like superhuman strength. So now I'm angry that I just slipped and hit my back. And so I just pick up, I stand up, and with one arm just yank him the rest of the way in. And I am very conscious when I pull him in that I don't push him all the way in to where his head is underneath the Gal 21 mount, because if he had a breathing issue, I wanted to be able to get to that right away. And so I immediately go back, make sure he's in, and then I go back and pick up my swimmer, get him on board, and I tell the skipper, or tell the hack, hey, we're good, let's go to the boat now. And I start looking at the patient, and he had eaten a lot of glass from the canopy on the way out, so he had a bunch of glass fragments in his neck, and I couldn't put a sea collar on him without worrying about pushing that glass further in. So I strap him to the litter, make sure his head is stable, and then we fly the 5-6 minutes back to the boat. and that's about all I know. But then when we get to the boat, I didn't realize the amount of casualty and chaos that had happened on board the flight deck. And so that's when our skipper, comes over the radio and says, hey, the flight deck is completely thawed out. We have nowhere for you to land. They're moving some jets around, and we're going to make a spot. And so we're like, oh, okay. And so sure enough, they move some jets just in front of the island, and they say, hey, we personally walked it. We know there's enough room. You guys are going to just sidestep and land there. So we land, and my swimmer is just so jacked. He's so amped. Like he knows he just got an F-35 pilot rescue. And then we start really looking, and this particular pilot is that same exact pilot that was giving my guys crap at the beginning of deployment for in the parallel.
Karma.
For being in his way. And he looks at me, and he said, did I hurt anybody or did I kill anybody? And I said, hey man, I don't know, but we're going to figure that out right now. And so we sidestep and land, and man, kudos to our squadron. Like we had just been operating at such a high level that even like there's chaos all over the flight deck normally, but this is on another level because there's just debris. I mean, there's just frag patterns all over the place. And then people are trying to quote unquote help when we land. And so people are starting to bum rush the aircraft to try to help unload this patient. Our PCs and our plane captains and our line check guys are out there like crowd control, like steering people away so that nobody else gets hurt with the spinning helicopter. And at one point I see one of our line check guys like tackle a guy, and I'm like, oh man, it's getting real here. So we unload the patient, turn him over to medical, and I send my swimmer along with him. And I said, hey, I don't know what kind of composites you were exposed to being in the water. How about you go with him and go get checked out? He's like, all right, sounds good. And then at that point, I get another crewman that runs up to me and says, hey, there was 2 man overboards during that evolution. We need to get and relaunch you guys because we don't know where they're at. And so I'm like, oh my God, we just used a bunch of gear. So, hey, we're going to go back to work. So I run back to the aircraft. We start reloading the cabin. And as we're getting ready to lift back off, they did get a head count, and they found the people, and they actually didn't fly off the side of the ship. So they were still on board the carrier. But at this point, that's only half the mission. So we successfully rescued the aviator, but he's critically injured. And then we have 3 critically injured people on board the ship that took major injuries during this evolution. And so we had 2 aircraft that were airborne supporting a different mission. And they were about 100 miles out, knew nothing about this. And so they're on their way back, and they get a radio call like, hey, hurry up, get back. And they happened to be our 2 dual auxiliary fuel tank configured aircraft. So they had the range, unlike the normal plane guard aircraft. And so when they landed, again, they have no idea. There's a whole fresh crew that's just, hey, get out, we're getting in, and we're going to unload these patients for medevac. And so, the medical team on the carrier is controlling their chaos and trying to get the patients ready for transport, and our corpsmen are up there, kind of trying to run the triage piece. And then I have crewmen that are just rigging the cabin, setting up ventilators, setting up monitors, setting everything up, and the whole shop is up there having some part. Whether I got guys running down to the hangar to grab extra litters, grab extra gear, grab extra med kits. I got guys, running down to the op center trying to get the info to the hospital they're going to go to. Like, everybody had a part, the whole shop, and I didn't have to say anything. Guys are just doing it, right? And so we're doing all this. We unload the patients, and one of the patients is intubated, and they sedated him because he had a open scroll cranial fracture, pretty severe. And so they sedated him, and the AW3 that was supposed to fly with me, he's now back on this medevac, so he's getting a second medevac, and he's flying with one of our corpsmen and a flight doc. They get on board, and the corpsman says, "Hey, sir, I just watched the drugs you pushed, and I don't think you pushed enough sedative, and I think he's going to wake up in flight, and it's going to create problems for us." And he's like, no, we're good to go. So they take off, and they start flying, and sure enough, he wakes up, and the ventilator stops working because the guy's trying to yank the breathing tube out. Mm-hmm. So they hold him down, they sedate him some more, and now they're moved on to just using a bag valve mask. And so that corpsman threw the AW3 a bag valve mask and said, "Hey, you're now breathing for this guy until I tell you to stop. You're going to do it for the next 400 miles, our transit into the hospital." And so, mind you, they have two auxiliary fuel tanks back there. They have 2 litter-bound patients and no room to even take a knee. So this AW3 is just in a catcher squat over the top of them, breathing for this guy for 2 hours as he's doing that. And so they land on the tarmac at the hospital or at the airport. They bring an ambulance, they transload the patients, and then that AW3 couldn't even move. His legs were so cramped up that couldn't move after that. And so, they just kind of pat him on the head and like, "Hey man, you did it. Let's go back to the boat."
Great work. Back to work.
Yeah, it was. And so for 39 hours, the medevac the night before, the rescue into the second medevac, our squadron was just humming. I mean, everybody from maintenance to the pilots, the aircrew, everybody was doing their fair share and doing their part. The rescue, albeit was awesome, and we did a really good job. So all told, from ejection to back on deck, it was 22 minutes with a litter-bound patient with a balloon parachute, get him out of the raft. So pretty good in open ocean to put an ejected aviator. So I was pretty pumped with that, but it seemed like an eternity to me. I thought we were there for 2 hours, and I'm like, man, this was so bad. We didn't do everything right. And looking back, it's like, man, we really did just crush that. That was good. And afterwards, after the chaos kind of settles down, the skipper and I were sitting there talking, and he's like, I don't know if what we just did was just business as usual for the Black Knights, or if this was just above and beyond. And I kind of paused and took a moment to think about it. And I looked at him and I said, "Well, sir, the night before, the medevac, that wasn't even for our strike group. That was for another strike group, and they couldn't support it, and they called us." And so to me, that tells us that we were better equipped, better prepared, or even just in the right spot, right time, and we got it done. And so we kind of had like a quick round robin in the shop late that night, talking to everybody in the shop, and we're kind of going around the room and just everybody talking about their part. And I learned some crazy stuff that doesn't ever get talked about. Like one of my AW3s, he had one of those smartwatches, and it said that he ran 11 miles and something like 180 flights of stairs that day because he was just running back and forth from the hangar deck all the way to the flight deck, carrying equipment, carrying gear, people, whatever, just running back and forth. And he's like, "I now know why I'm tired. I have no idea that I ran 11 miles over 180 flights of stairs in that short amount of time." And so we're kind of like, as morbid AWs are, we're sitting there like, beating our chest a little bit. And I kind of had a moment of clarity, and I told the guys in the shop, like, "Hey, be proud of yourselves. You guys did awesome. And it was a great thing that we were there. But at the end of the day, this was a catastrophic event, and some people are critically injured. We need to, when we're walking around the ship, we can, internal to our own shop and our own space, we can beat our chest, high five each other, and be proud of the work we just did. But have some compassion and remorse to the folks that maybe don't see that every day, and understand that they may be in a different headspace than where you're at, and they may be dealing with that. They may have just saw their friend or a coworker just get critically injured, and they could have been inches away from that. So that's
solid advice. In those moments, it is tough because you guys are coming down from a massive high. The question is this normal operations or above and beyond? The answer is yes,
Right.
because that's what we're there for. But when the call comes, you guys responded and you did it, and you did it very proficiently, above and beyond. And you don't get those calls every single day, thank goodness.
Right.
But you're right, because your high is someone else's low,
Right.
because you
And
just saved their lives.
that's the nature of our business. We're kind of a bunch of vultures. Like we're, when I was a younger AW, I was praying for something to happen. Like, oh
Hmm.
man, crash, and now looking back after 20 something years, I'm like, what a morbid way of looking at that. Like
Hmm.
I would rather have a whole career of no rescues because everybody came back with all 10 fingers, 10
Hmm.
toes, and they get to go home and talk about it later. And luckily the end of this story is everybody is alive. Everybody made it.
Okay.
Everybody is in good shape. But yeah, what a crazy turn of events.
Yeah, what
In just
happened? Like, what caused the crash?
Well, I haven't seen the official release of the investigation, but I think he was just coming in too low. Didn't judge the angle of arrival there, and just hit the back of the ship. Just came in too low and
Yeah.
smacked the round down on the back of the ship, and it just caused a catastrophic incident.
That's
It was
crazy that you saw it, and those are things you can't unsee.
right.
I'm curious because after you guys were done, you probably ate, relaxed a little bit, just kind of like calm down, but you're running on that slow motion high. Like you said, everything just kind of slows down, thank goodness, because you're so micro focused and you're doing your job, you train for this, and everyone's doing their thing and above and beyond. What was the after effects as a whole? Because it's not just, you and your swimmer in this incident, there's multiple, the whole shop was basically just dealing with some traumatic events. And everyone, once you come down from that high, it affects us differently.
Yeah, I kind of forecasted this and said, I'm not professional enough to be able to speak on this. I'm not a counselor. I'm not,
Hmm.
but I do know we have resources available. So I went and grabbed the CAG chaplain and said, "Hey, sir, you mind coming in and just talking to the shop? Just sit down, school circle, and just let our guys just kind of do an event reconstruction, so they can tell their part." And we did that. And so the CAG chaps came by for about 2 hours in the shop, and we just went around the room, and everybody's kind of talking. And there was some laughs, there were some tears.
Yeah.
One of our guys, he had an incident before deployment, unrelated, off duty, but he was in the San Diego Bay and saw his girlfriend get pretty injured on a Sea-Doo incident, and had a compound fracture on her leg. He had to swim her to shore and give her over to the EMS team when they met her on the beach. And he didn't really think anything of that. Just like, well, whatever. I took my girlfriend to the hospital. It was all good. And then when this incident happened, he happened to be helping load the stretcher or the litter onto the aircraft with one of the patients. And the female patient that they were loading on the aircraft, she looked up at him and said, "Hey, am I going to die?" And he just said he broke down. He just lost it because he said
Yeah.
his girlfriend said the same exact thing when he
Oh,
loaded
wow.
her onto the ambulance, and it just hit him. And so, that's excuse me, that's the level of maturity that we had to be able to have those kinds of discussions. But
Yeah.
at the same time, you don't know how you're going to react until you're thrown into that.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think everybody is stronger and better for it. We learned a
Hmm.
lot as a unit and as a shop, and I'm super proud of those guys. And they crushed it. It was eye
Yeah.
watering to watch
You should be
everybody do
proud
their
of
job.
yourself too, because some of the things that you've mentioned are pretty, well, in my day, were very unusual because we never talked about anything. You just did your thing. And then, 20, 30 years later, you wonder why things are triggering you. So the fact
Yeah,
that you're at least, you know, doing what you can, and um, you're right. You're not a counselor, but you're in a leadership position, and you brought someone in, a third party, and allowed your team to be vulnerable, and that it's okay not to be okay type of mentality, and you're stronger because of it. So that's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah. I remember back my first deployment on the USS Kitty Hawk. God, I'm old. But on
Yeah,
the
I was on the Connie, so
yeah. So you get it. But on the Kitty Hawk, I remember one night I was going to pre-flight the Alert 30, and at the time the squadron SOP was if it was the middle of the night pre-flight, the junior swimmer and the junior pilot were the ones that went and did the pre-flight. They weren't waking up the hack, and they weren't waking up the crew chief.
Yep.
And so my crew chief was our shop senior chief, and my hack was, I honestly don't even remember, but I do remember the co-pilot. So we go up there, and they're still doing flight ops. So I'm up there, we're pre-flighting the aircraft, and it's stuffed in the helo hole. And so I finished the bottom in the cabin, making sure everything's good. And he's still up on the rotor head looking at the engines. And so I'm standing there waiting for him so that we can walk down together. And as I'm standing there, I'm standing on the foul line because, you know, they have this mythical line that if you're on this side, you're totally safe. And if you're on the other side, you're, you know, catastrophic injury. And so I'm standing on the foul line, just watching jets come in and trap, thinking, man, nobody else in the world is able to get this close to a jet line. Like, this is awesome, right? And as I'm standing there, somebody taps me on the shoulder, and I turn around, and it was my pilot who just finished pre-flight. And on the way down of that pre-flight, he caught his float coat on the side of the aircraft, and so it inflated. And so I'm like laughing at him, like, oh, you dummy! Like, we got to go down and get you a new float coat. So let's get out of here. So we had just turned around to walk back inside the skin of the ship, and that is when the F-13 or the F-18 snapped that 3-wire. Was the very next trap.
Oh my
and
gosh.
The aircraft we had just pre-flighted got cut in half by that 3-wire. And the guy that I was standing next to watching jets land, he ended up getting his leg amputated above the knee. And if I hadn't have been standing right, my pilot hadn't had a dumb mistake and tapped me on the shoulder, I would have been right there next to him, laid up. And so I remember that, and we didn't talk about that. Like, nobody even socialized that. It was just kind of, we did the rescue and we moved on. And I remember that hit me at the end of this rescue, and I'm like, no, I don't think I would have even known what to say during that when I was a young 21-year-old, but I'm going to give these guys the opportunity. So I just, that still lives with me today, watching that guy with a missing limb. So I wanted to make sure that these guys had an opportunity to do that. And I think that subconsciously was what drove me to go and get somebody in the shop to do that.
Yeah. Well, someone's watching over you.
Yeah, for sure.
That's amazing. And yes, you took that and you made good on it. And yeah, it's so important, and it's so ridiculous. And I think most people, there's some hardened OGs that'll be like, I don't have feelings. But I think most people are just, they regret, just the mentality back then of just stuff it away, because as you get older, guess what? Time does slow down as far as your actions and everything else. So then you have time to think, and those things really do bubble up. And it's these things that you never will think, trigger you, and then, you're going to respond probably negatively. So that's awesome.
Yeah, it was an adventure. That's for sure.
That's cool. Thanks for sharing that story. I know that you're in Fallon, and you have a couple just recent rescues that you did. You want to talk about those?
Yeah, sure. So in August, we had a CAG-5. Coincidentally, the air wing that's from Japan. They don't get to come out here for air wing training too often. In fact, the last time they were here was, I think, 9 or 10 years ago. And so they came up here to do some training, and they were out doing a practice combat search and rescue event. So they're out there on the range just training, and my staff and we were prepping for the next WTI course. And so we went out to go do a night aerial gunnery shoot. So we're out there shooting, and the next thing you know, we get a radio call from range control saying, hey, you guys need to contact base. So we climb up an elevation to get a line of sight with base, and we contact them, and we're like, hey, what's going on? We're like, hey, we don't have much information. We just need you to flow direct to Mount Augusta, which is one of the prominent mountains on the range. So we start flying there, and we're like, well, what are we looking for? And they're like, hey, we got a couple C-cell radio hits, and we have lost radar contact of 2 aircraft from the visiting helicopter squadron. So we're like, oh no. And so we start flying that way, and we see a smoke plume from almost the peak. I mean, right at the top. And the top at Mount Augusta, if I remember right, it's right around like 95, maybe 9,800 feet. And it was just below that on the south shoulder. And we see the smoke cloud. And so we start flying over there, and sure enough, there's 2 aircraft that have crashed. And again, we were doing a gun shoot. We weren't prepared for this. And so we're like, okay, now we got to shift focus and start, rigging the cabin for rescue. And at this point, we don't really know how many people are in the 2 aircraft. And we find out after back and forth talking to base that we're looking for 10 people. And so we're like, man, we have 2 aircraft between us, but we're both configured with all the guns and stuff. And like, man, how are we going to get 10 people in here? And by the grace of God, I mean, I truly mean this. Like, we land, start running down the mountain, we start consolidating people and getting a hold of people. And then we start getting a head count and created like a casualty collection point, started triaging. And then, but everybody, I mean, all 10 people walked on their own 2 feet, met us halfway down the mountain, and we walked him the rest of the way, got him in the aircraft, and flew him to the hospital, and everybody was released the next day. It was insane that everybody walked away. But that just goes to show, you launch on one mission, totally unrelated to the unit that's even in town, and next thing you know, you're getting called to go do something completely different. Again, pretty wild.
That's I think the appeal of our job too, right?
Right.
Because you never truly know. In every scenario that you've even talked about, in the last 50 minutes has been that you didn't even know your one swimmer had a medevac throughout the night.
Right.
It's just, there's always stuff going on. And guess what? First and last to launch, helo, always in the air and being diverted for, it could be the lamest thing ever, like I don't know, vice president or secretary of defense or something needs a ride and they want to bring some SEALs on board to, give them, I don't know, some firepower or whatever. So it's like a flight attendant.
You're absolutely right. That is what's kept me going this whole 22 years. It's because every single day is different. Every single one. Not one is the same. And you can take away some nugget of wisdom and expertise, and you can learn something every single day. And I've really tried hard to make sure that I didn't atrophy my own skill set, but also I'm learning a lot from even the new guys. Like there's new equipment that's coming out. There's new tactics that are being developed, and some of these younger guys are just so hungry and so motivated and passionate that they're coming in and like, hey, senior, we want to try this. And I'm like, all right, let's walk through this on the ground and let's see if this makes sense. And then, and then sometimes, hey, let's go take it to the pool and let's see if this makes sense. And if it does, all right, let's take it a step further. Let's see if we can make this mountain out of a molehill here, and see if we can make it work. And we've been super successful doing that. And I think that just goes to show the luxury that we have, that we often take for granted, of the flexibility that we bring to the fight. As a naval service, especially in the rescue community, everybody else is so rigid. They have these, protocols, or they have these doctrines, or, and for us, we're just kind of so flexible to be able to react to everything. And some guys say, jack of all trades, master of none. And I totally disagree with that. I think there's a master to every piece of our job somewhere in the fleet. And whether you're picking up those nuggets of knowledge, or whether you're seeking out that information, that's on you, right? You need to be hungry, and you need to be able to go out and seek that information. If you don't know something, or you're not as proficient at something, you need to go out of your way to get better at that and recognize your own shortcomings. And that's a huge thing that I try to stress on the team here, and they take it on board for sure.
It's life and death too. I remember when I was we were deployed, and even the first time I did vert rep, you got hundreds, thousands of pounds hanging below an aircraft. I'd never done that before. It's like it's on the job training. But guess what? I better learn, and I better do it very well, or else, it can be super dangerous, or you're dropping, weapons into the ocean, and then who knows, you have to recover all that stuff. There's a lot that can go wrong, but like every mission set, you may not have done it before. Hopefully the person next to you has, and they're paired up together, and maybe you have that training, maybe you don't. But you're right. You better become a master like very quickly, and the resources are out there.
And I think things like your book, your podcast are really going to help out with that, because the information, some people wouldn't even know that they even have a lack of information or knowledge. And sometimes they just need to reach out and be like, oh, I didn't know that, or I wouldn't have thought of that. These are just little nuggets I've learned throughout the years, and we all have our own little idiosyncrasies. And unfortunately, some of those things, like how you pre-flight even, can be something that you learned the hard way. And you're like, man, I mean, I listened to your podcast with John Showerman and the pre-flight incident with the litter. It's like, man, I've done that, I've definitely been like, oh, it's good, and it's like, man, I triple checking everything and trust but verify, or all the things that go a long way. But being humble enough to recognize that you still got learning to do. I still have learning to do. And I try to get better every single day.
Yeah, that's great. So this is a part of the podcast where I usually do like a 1-minute hypothetical scenario. It seems like you've done so many different things. What's a rescue that you have not done that you would not want a hypothetical scenario about?
Let's see.
You give me a scenario.
All right. Let's see. I have never done any like confined area any of that. And that honestly, I don't think as a community we train enough for that.
Mm-mm.
And so I think that would scare the bejesus out of me if I got tasked to go do something like that.
Okay. So like a cave diving rescue?
Yes, or upturned boat, somebody trapped inside.
Okay. We'll
Any
do
of that.
we'll go Larry Grossman on you. Okay, here's the scenario. A small submarine suffers a catastrophic failure and partially sinks in shallow waters. Crew members escape to the surface but are scattered and in distress. Let's see. Partially okay. Let's say you hear pounding inside the submarine once you're in the water.
All right. Well,
Actually,
I know
the
this.
scenario is the mindset of as you get this partial information and you're
Right.
heading out, but you can take it any way that you want.
Well, I think the first thing that I want to know is do I have backup? Right? Do I have another aircraft or another swimmer that's available? And if not readily available, let's get people on the horn and let's get some extra help here to because this is going to be a mass casualty scenario and potentially going to be a long time. May even be longer than what our aircraft has fuel to stay on station. Uh, and then I'm going to put a bug in the pilot's ears to let them figure out this part, but I'm going to ask them where are we taking these people, figure that out, and they can basically figure that out on the fly. And then what I'm thinking about is, okay, what equipment do I have available to me right now? And in the aircraft that we standardly fly with not a lot. I have some swimmer equipment and some medical equipment and some hoist equipment, but outside of that, I'm going to try to triage and collect as many people as I can and get them to a stable flotation. So if I have to deploy a raft, I'm going to be prepared to do that. Start stacking people on the raft, start getting people in there, and then if I got people trapped in there, I'm going to try to, those submarines are so big. There's no way I'm diving down and trying to get in there. But I know we're going to need a dive team immediately, so we're going to get them on the horn to get them out there, and then maybe a surface vessel to be able to put in some surface, small rib boats, some surface swimmers, just all hands on deck. Let's get the team all together because we're all operating under the same procedures. So I know what they're doing and what they're bringing to the fight. So let's all work together.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. What's fun is, I'm having people on the podcast that, have been out for 30, 40 years. The mindset is so similar how you can just, no matter you're still active, you're
Right.
just in the red all the time. Just how, I don't know, I guess once you've done this job, it doesn't take long. Obviously the further you get away from anything, you get a little more stale, but for the most part, our minds are very much morphed into a way of thinking.
Right.
And you're assessing that situation, reassessing, and just thinking of all possibilities because you can't save them all, but you are sure going to try.
Right.
Thank you for just all the information. I mean, it's so thorough and just so cool. Just everything that you've done, all you're doing. And you've had all these incredible experiences that not many can relate to or even understand. What's a bit of wisdom that you would leave our listeners with?
I think the three tenets that I try to live by that I think are good advice is always remain humble, credible, and approachable. And I instill that on myself and my own ethos, and then also in the team here, because I don't know everything, and I need to be able to foul up and fess up when I don't, but I know where to find the information, right? So, being that humble humility person to be able to have that, and then the approachability for that, and then that just builds your credibility, right? Like you're not just being a yes man, you're not being the person that's just like, oh, I know the answer, I know how to do this, I'm the expert, I'm perfect, because that's going to dovetail into some catastrophic problems later on, and that is just something I would strive for everybody to take on board.
Yeah, military or not, it's such good wisdom. Like I've been out for a couple decades and definitely seen it on the outside, and it's just ego can get so in the way
Yeah.
of just moving forward. It's just who cares if you're right or not, if you got the
Right.
right answer, if you're approachable, if you're humble, you have grace for others. I mean, there's just so many lessons around that. So I think it's just great advice. And I think just one thing that I want to know, and anyone who's watching this video, is how did you grow such a beautiful mustache? That is
Well, it's funny. It only comes once a year. My wife hates it, can't stand it, and our anniversary is always in the fall. And so I tell her I'm gonna grow it in the spring. I cheated because I started in over Christmas break, and I'll keep it throughout the spring, and then I'll shave it again right before my retirement, right before our anniversary, because when we go take anniversary photos, she's like, "I want that mustache gone." I'm like, "Oh, sounds good."
That's so funny. My wife's the same way. I've been growing this beard out for my whole life, 50 years, and that's about as good as I get. I got nothing. But yeah, even if I tried though, my wife's like, "No, get rid of it." Okay. Yes, ma'am. Cool.
Aye,
Well,
aye is the correct response.
Mikey, thank you so much for
My
sharing your
pleasure.
wisdom, your stories, everything. It's been a blast to have you on and just to interact with you, collaborate, in socials and everything else. I love what you're doing out there as well. So congratulations on a great career.
Thank you.
You're almost there. You can see the light, and
Oh
then
yeah.
and then it's the next career of just enjoying, relaxing. And I know that you're going to serve others. It's just
Right.
who you are, and you're going to find, whatever that next thing, and you probably have an idea already what that'll be, but I think your plan is mapped out for you beyond this world, and you're walking it out, and I'm really proud of you.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it.
Yep. And for everyone else, we will see you on the next podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Calm in the Chaos podcast. Please subscribe to be notified of future episodes, and if you enjoyed what you just heard, please leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts. Until next time, get out there and make a difference so others may live.